So welcome to the PleinAir podcast from PleinAir Magazine. My name is Eric Rhodes. I'm the publisher and founder of PleinAir Magazine. In the PleinAir Magazine podcast, we dive into the world of outdoor painting called PleinAir painting. And for those who don't know, plein air is a French term essentially meaning the open air or the outdoors. The French say plein air, others pronounce it plain air. But no matter how you say it, it's a huge movement of artists around the country, around the world really, who are going outdoors to paint. This podcast is brought to you by PleinAir Magazine's Publishers Invitational. It's summer camp for artists in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, one of America's best kept secrets. And you'll come for a week of painting and leave with a collection of about 15 or 20 paintings that you've done in the stunning scenery in the Adirondacks. And you'll make lots of new friends, paint with some incredible painters, and have a great memory. All levels are invited, beginners to pro, and we paint and hang out together. We sing at night, we do portraits, and you may be painting next to somebody famous, or you may be somebody famous. It doesn't matter, we're all equals at this event. We roll out of bed, we paint 3-4 paintings a day, and then we hang out at night. You can learn more at publishersinvitational.com. It's my desire to see more people fall in love with plein air painting, and you can help by sharing this podcast with your friends on social media or email. And I hope you'll subscribe on iTunes so it comes to you every single week. And of course, we would love for you to go to iTunes and leave a comment or a rating. And if you've not got our ebook, 240 Tips on Plein Air Painting by some of the top painters in the world, you can pick it up free at pleinairtips.com. And if you have feedback or interview requests, email me, Eric, at pleinairmagazine.com. The podcast is also brought to you by our brand new publication, appropriate for today, American Watercolor, with editor Kelly Kane. We're very proud to have Kelly, who was formerly the editor of Watercolor Artist Magazine, and who's doing a beautiful job on this new project. Kelly is also the new editor of PleinAir Magazine, as our longtime editor Steve Doherty has just recently retired. And check out the new publication, AmericanWatercolor.net. So we're going to get right to our interview with Stuart White. And Stuart and I are live at the PleinAir convention. Hi, guys. Make some noise. We actually have an audience for the first time in the history of the PleinAir podcast. Stuart, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, PleinAir Magazine.
So, Stuart, tell everybody a little bit about your career. Give us a couple of bullet points that would be really helpful so they can understand what it is you do and what your focus is.
I come by PleinAir painting just through the pragmatics of sketching what people look like when they're sitting on umbrellas, because I come from an architectural background, and I needed to dress up the buildings with what they call entourage. And that means including cars and trees and again, people in pleasant spaces.
Right.
So I found myself out sketching a lot, and that was just a natural thing to be doing. And then I came to find in Annapolis that there were actually events called PleinAir events, and that people were doing this. And you can't just walk in, you have to apply almost a year in advance, and so I looked into it some more, and I haven't quit since. It's a habit.
So you were not a painter per se. You were an architect. You were doing renderings for architecture.
Well, it's always been a hobby. I was always aspired to be a painter. This is the pragmatics of. Thank you. All the pragmatics of making a living involved doing commercial work, I suppose.
All right. And so the hobby, the painting hobby began when you were a kid?
Yeah, to me, it was a way of expressing. My father was a builder, and he had a lot of jobs after World War II in Europe, building air bases and things like that. So I grew up for the better part of my childhood in Europe. And I found that communicating by drawing was the best way to get over the language barrier. And so, if you could find quick shorthands for drawing,
right,
it was a good communicator. And I just loved drawing at that point, ever since I was, I think, 6.
All right. So tell me about your journey once you decided that there was this thing called plein air painting. What happened next?
Well, I stuck to watercolor. I noticed everybody was using oil, and to me, watercolor was the traveler's medium. It was handy. It was easy to get around. So I thought, well, if there was the quick draw, to me that was an automatic no-brainer is I was going to do watercolor. And that actually introduced me to a lot of the oil painters and the pastel painters that are doing this, and I became fascinated with their approaches to painting. And I was surprised there weren't that many other watercolors, which is what I'm pretty much known for in this.
Yeah, very well known. You and I first kind of met, you were the winner of the PleinAir Salon, I think the second one? Second one. And you won a $15,000 grand prize?
Yeah, that was a life changer.
Now, well, tell me about that. Why was it a life changer?
Well, I think it was in the crowd as big as the auditorium, and to be standing there with this big check, it sort of it hit me. I actually had nothing to say except the ubiquitous, "Oh, this is awesome!" But the reality was that it was sort of a wonderful acknowledgement of the work I put into drawing and painting, and to be recognized for that was a huge honor for me. And I sort of carried it with me ever since.
And so, did it have any impacts on your career in any other ways?
Yes, I think it did. I think that having your painting on the cover of a magazine helps. My mother was very proud, and it just became a motivator of like, yeah, this is really something that I want to hone my skills and my crafts, and I wanted to get more involved in painting events, so I became a member of a local painting event. And there was a vacuum there to be president, so I took that on, and then that forced me to take on skills of management that I didn't know I had, and so it just opened up an awful lot of things I never think I would have ever tried.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if I remember you saying something about this in the past, you started getting some invitations to some events and things of that nature. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
The Door County, which was a very prestigious thing, they called me on soon after that.
Yeah.
So there was definitely a action and reaction.
So I want to probe this just a little bit longer. So you entered the competition. Did you ever even think you had a chance at winning? You must have had some belief that you could win, or you wouldn't have entered.
I did. I thought that being a watercolor painter, that maybe those paintings might stand out from the vast sea of other paintings that were there, and so that it was a good. I thought I had a good chance, and I became one of the finalists. And in fact, the one that won the best watercolor wasn't the one that I actually won the big award. It was another one that I submitted that somebody liked, which was the one that was on the cover.
Well, again, congratulations on that, even though it's like 5 years later.
I'd still accept congratulations.
Yeah. So you've often talked about how you're a travel nut. Tell me how that all began.
Well, like I said, grew up traveling.
And where were you traveling growing up?
Spain, France, England, Germany, Turkey, Tunisia. How'd
that happen?
Dad,
yeah,
he was
military?
a builder.
Builder,
Yeah,
I see.
He was a builder, and my mother didn't like it so much because she had 4 kids and dragging them around, and my dad was also a hunter, and back then you could actually take a rifle onto the plane. So we got a lot of great stories. That was a great childhood. I really enjoyed it. But my mother, to her credit, and I know she's going to hear this, loved taking us to museums, and I got the privilege to see, the original Impressionists for the first time in the museums and not prints. And and I think seeing those paintings, my first Van Gogh was at the top of the stairs, which was the church with the road that has it.
Right.
I had never seen a painting like that in my life, and I had to know more about him and Van Gogh's life, and I loved the color that he was working with. And I was 14 at the time, and I believe that's what I want to do, because those are the kind of paintings that you see in your dreams. They were beyond the sort of like stiff brown umber paintings that were like seas of them prior to the 19th century Impressionist paintings.
Right. So it really stood out. Now, you have kids?
I do.
Take them to museums?
I do.
Mine fight me on that sometimes. Dad, not another museum.
No, I do have a daughter, and I think she's quite receptive to looking at museums. I remember watching her stand in front of a Jackson Pollock for the longest time, so I was really proud of that. Yeah.
So we're talking about museums. Talk to me about museum rats.
I'm not familiar with that term, but I think they get the impression it's like that's where you go for your recreation. To me, that's I've often liked to sit in front of one or two particular paintings and just soak them in and try to take, what is the painter doing here? What's going on? Why are my eyes so stuck on that?
Yeah.
And I live near Washington, D.C., and the National Gallery is free to go into, and they have the most incredible collection of Ashcan school painters and Degas. Just beautiful, beautiful work that you can look at any time you want to.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be able to copy or to at least try to figure out how they created it.
That's right.
So do you study oil paintings as well, even though you're a watercolor painter?
Avidly.
Yeah.
Avidly, yeah.
Yeah. And what are you looking for for somebody who might be listening, who's just kind of learning about the plein air movement? We're up to 240,000 listeners now. Don't be nervous. But so 240,000 people out there, a lot of them are new to painting. A lot of them are maybe haven't painted yet, maybe are just starting, maybe they haven't plein air painted yet. So talk a little bit about the value of going to museums and understanding what do you look for, what should they be looking for?
That's a great question, Eric. I think the thing they should be looking for is to just take note of what their sensations are inside. Why is that jumping out, and why do I dislike that one? And look at that one, and try to understand your prejudices about a certain thing. And it might be like 16th century icons that you just don't like, but maybe it's a good idea to just stop and try to see what it's doing and understand your feelings. On the paintings that you do like, try to understand, well, what's the simple thing that's happening here? Is it color? Is it the composition? Is it the story behind that? Is that what I'm drawn to? So there's so many levels that you can appreciate these static, two-dimensional, slabs of color standing on a wall, but they have such power once you are still in front of them and taking them in.
So let's talk about watercolor painting. The plein air community tends to be dominated by oil painters. There are some galleries who used to think that oil paintings sold better than watercolor paintings. I don't know if they think that anymore. What do you run into? What are your feelings about the various mediums, and why specifically, other than what we talked about, are you using watercolor?
Well, the first part about the perception, I do think that still holds true, that you go to any galleries, you're going to see a lot of oil paintings, and I think the advantages there are real quite obvious. You can paint very large. You don't have to deal with a lot of the glass and a lot of fuss with watercolor. So it's got its own drawbacks. I think that watercolor is very demanding, and it's not easy to do. It's not easy to do well. I'm glad to see that in the plein air community there are more and more of them coming up, and because of these workshops that we have here, you can take advantage of everybody else's little tips and secrets. So there's a lot of advantage of having a community of watercolor painters. I still think that there's a lot of bad watercolor work out there because of the sort of approach is very different than oil painting, and you have to look at it through like the paper is what's giving the power of light and color rather than the paint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so, it makes sense to me, but it might not make sense to the person listening. So in oil painting, it's additive. In watercolor, it's you basically, like if you want pure white, like we were watching Alvaro last night, he left certain things pure white and didn't touch them. So that's really subtractive, is it not?
That's right. That's right. I mean, without getting into a whole lot of chemistry, light waves go through the pigment, hit the white surface, and bounce back through the pigment as if you were looking at stained glass. That's probably the best way to put it. And in an additive way, with oil, you're applying your layers of minerals and paint, and the light hits it. Although it has a translucent, it is mostly staying on the surface and bouncing back to your eyeballs.
Okay. So I think that watercolor is the hardest medium to learn because you have to think way ahead. With oil painting, if I decide I want to put a tree in, I can put a tree in, but it's not really quite the same with watercolor, is it? Maybe it is with a tree, but it seems like you have to think about 30 steps ahead. Is that accurate?
Somewhat. I wouldn't, it's not as forbidding as it could be. You can keep redoing washes over and over as long as the paint is, the paper's still moist. You can sort of lift pigments and keep going and keep going. There's a certain level of forgiveness to all that. I find the first couple of washes to be extremely anxiety-ridden for me. And that's exactly the time that people come up and start wanting to talk to you. But so I find that the watercolor is demanding of your attention, and it's a focused attention at the very beginning. And then after it's sort of moving along, I think you can sort of relax and start to make decisive decisions at a certain pace. But timing is so important in watercolor, which is not so critical in oil.
Because of the fast drying?
The drying in particular. And the paint is still cooking while you're working. It's making chemical changes. And you can let some of those things happen. Those are called the happy accidents. Or you can sort of quickly try to regroup and see what you can do to save it. But the thing about the paper is that it is so unforgiving. It reveals every little thing you do. Any hesitation in the wash shows up as a streak a little bit later on. I do like that it's a focused period of time of which you cannot think about anything else. It demands your attention. And it's a meditation of sorts that way. And that's why it's really special to me to have that moment to do that, because otherwise my mind will drift in a million different directions.
So you teach a lot of watercolor painting. You do workshops?
I do.
Yeah. So tell me about the common things that you run into that maybe misperceptions of students. You talked earlier about there are a lot of bad paintings out there. What are the things that you find students are consistently doing wrong? Maybe there's not a right or wrong. Maybe it's just a matter of opinion. But what are the things that you like to help them work on? And maybe you can share some ideas on how to accomplish those things, which is tough when you're talking about just the voice and not being able to demonstrate it.
Yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb and say I'm going to make up that there is a right and there is a wrong. I'm just going to make that up, and I'm going to just establish that there is definitely a wrong way to approach watercolor painting.
All right.
But what I think is that if you look into an exhibit where I might be judging a show and I look across the room, I'll see what a real beginner's approach to painting is. And it's a lot of time, it's very washed out. There's a lot of weak colors. The values are almost all the same. The greens and blues, which are analogous, meaning they're very same in value and intensity. It's a blue sky, it's a green tree, and the tube colors are used a lot. And there's not a lot of playfulness with the material and with color mixing. And I feel, color is so an important part of watercolor because it can be so fresh and sparkling. And it's not so much how well you draw, and it's not so much how well you apply the paint. But it's really the juicy, lovely quality of the material itself that really draws people in to admire a painting. And that if you're not exploiting that aspect of it, you're really not approaching the material in the proper way. You get too caught up in, I want to copy that, or I want to do that way, or I want to paint that the way it looks in nature. But I think that's not really the important thing about a painting. What's wonderful about a painting is to have that magical effect, the illusion that these raw materials can create an atmosphere, or cars in steamy weather, and that's the magic of it, and that's the appeal for me in any event.
Now, lots of watercolorists don't go outdoors to paint. You do. Talk to people about the benefits of going outdoors and the downside.
Yeah, great. Well, going outside is where you learn from nature, and I think if you stand still long enough in front of something, time passes, and as time is passing, things are happening. Different things occur that don't happen in a photograph, and just seeing photographs. And I love working from photographs, but your notion that you started out with in doing a scene or a picture start to change as you notice in phenomena of nature, what's going on in the shadows, what's happening with a sense of movement. And then when the lights start to change, maybe even just dealing with the elements. Like today we have a windy day, that's going to be something we'll play with later on, which it's maddening, but it'll affect the drying time, and so you have to address those sort of things. So there's a lot of challenges. The other part of your question was about the downside of it?
Yeah. Is there a downside?
Well, I suppose you could say that sometimes unwanted attention may be something that you find annoying, like mosquitoes, or it's like what are you painting?
My mother is a painter.
That's a
my
classic.
aunt is a painter.
And I have to look at those things as with a little bit more generosity, that I think people see somebody painting, and though you don't have a sign on your back saying, please come talk to me, there's some sort of desire to want to make a connection with the painter. And there's sort of an awkward, what do I say to this person who's involved in a painting? And it's usually something really like inane, like that.
Right.
But it's coming from a good spot. It's coming from a good place of, I want to make a contact with this because this is kind of interesting. It's part of my theater of seeing people out there painting. And if anybody out there was like nervous about that, about your performance as a painter, I'd encourage you to say that I've never had somebody say, you have no idea what you're doing and you shouldn't be doing this. I find for the most part that people are pretty generous with their compliments and encouragement in what they're doing, no matter what level of skill you're at.
I was painting in Paris, and there were about 10 or 12 teenagers that were hanging out watching me. And finally, one of them came up and he said, you suck as an artist and you really should give this up now. And all the kids laughed. It did not discourage me.
Yeah, good for you. I was
even though they were probably right.
I think I'd feel bad. I would, but fortunately, I think that's a rare situation. Are you sure your French was up to date? That they weren't mistranslated?
No, they were speaking English. Believe me. So, talk to me about the blessings of the community of artists, because you're very involved in your local community. Talk about the benefits of that support group and having those other people around you.
That's a wonderful question, because I think without a community like the PleinAir community, you are kind of working in a vacuum. And throughout history, there have been good examples of that. Van Gogh, for example, I can't imagine what he would have done had he had a support group like a PleinAir event in Arles. And
what a great idea. Let's do it.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, okay.
But I feel like, despite Van Gogh, he was a stubborn fellow, and I think he did just fine on his own. But I do think that for myself personally, I really, really cherish the community of painters that I meet at these conferences, and we meet at the PleinAir competitions and at the various events, and in your local clubs we get together and paint. And this time of year when the tulips are coming out and cherry trees are in blossom, we get out with groups, and then you're sort of a theater for other people who are also out. And I find I meet a lot of people that way who come from different backgrounds who would also like to paint, and it gives them the courage to get out and paint too. There's a lot of great equipment out now that makes it pretty easy, to get out and get started. But really, I mean, I think that getting with other painters, getting your work out there, critting each other, and I'm not just glad-handing everybody, but actually getting people to maybe try to see what your blind sides are, what you're not seeing about your work.
Well, one of the things that I think is important is I find that people say something kind of in hopes that you're going to give them some encouragement. Because I hear things, when I'm outdoors painting, I hear things like, I wish I could do that, I don't have any talent. And I always make a point to stop and give them encouragement. Say, listen, this is a learned skill. Talent comes in way later, but you can accomplish this, you can do this, and it's a process that you have to follow. And sometimes I'll even say, let me show you a couple things. Or sometimes I'll put the brush in their hand and I'll say, here, try this, and make a stroke. I do that a lot with kids, with the parents' permission, of course. And, of course, I can't ruin my paintings, they're already bad. But in your case, it may be a different story.
No, I'm glad you brought up the kids thing, because I think children, for the most part, are naturally creative.
Yeah.
And I think we, through the process of learning and education, we get a lot of our creativity kind of whacked out of us, and we get sort of, you're not good at that and you're good at that. And we sort of identify with that as we grow older, and we start to go into these areas of specialization of what we want to be when we grow up. And I think we could stifle a lot of those qualities that we had as children. Before we started saying, it's like, it doesn't look like a car, it doesn't look like a tree. And there's sort of, a lot of teachers, unfortunately, had this sort of way of like, a tree trunk is brown, and and this is that, and you realize there's colors in all kind of things.
So how do you get that stuff out of your head? Because it's like you always have the lollipop tree and the colors, the sky's always blue, the clouds are always a certain way. How do you beat that? Because that stuff was beat into us when we were kids. How do we get it out of there?
Well, I think it's a good idea to remain as immature as possible throughout your life, like I have.
And you're living proof.
And I think unlearning is a part of our lives. I think that I'm unlearning all the time and of things. I think in the idea, going back to your thing about the beginning, who's a beginner and who's a master, I think those are just convenient titles. I don't know what they mean a whole lot, but I think we're all beginners. I feel like a beginner all the time. I think it's a good attitude to have. I think somebody once said is like, well, if I go to heaven, I hope there's paint up there, because we're never going to run out of time to learn the things there are to learn about painting.
I think I'm curious about what the impact of this plein air movement is going to be, because you think about, you go back to Paris when you had Monet and friends hanging out in a local pub, essentially, 5 or 6 or 10 of them, and they would meet there on a regular basis. And that was kind of the extent of the movement. Right, and today, here we are at the Plein Air Convention. We had 1,100 people here, and it's impacting the movement either positively or negatively. I'm curious what your thoughts are, what the impact is, and what you think this could result in as a result of the movement.
Yeah, there's a long answer to that, but I'll give the short one, is that as art movements go, actually outdoor painting I don't think is a movement, but I do think it is as Impressionism was, it was a way of getting the studio out into the streets where people saw otherwise private activity. And that was made possible by being able to put paint into tubes and making them transportable, and then the portable easel and all that good stuff. And I think the idea of going out, people have always been going out and painting, and even during the height of modernism. And those are the sort of movements that we've had in the 20th century. Now to sit in a room of 1,000 people like we did last night, and to see everybody was enthusiastic about taking their easels out and painting, and you could almost say it is a movement like that, but it's kind of, I look at it as there's a big enough body of support to encourage representational painting and the skills that are involved in cultivating in that process.
Right. And
I think that's very valuable in almost any discipline, whether you want to become a pro or you just use it to enhance your communication skills. And I mean that by coming to workshop, describing what's going on, and why are we doing this? Why it can be incredibly complicated to some people. It can be very simple. It can be relaxing. It can be incredibly anxiety-ridden for others. It's just how everybody approaches it. The landscape never changes. It's all going on inside of you as a painter. That's all the transformation going on.
So we have a lot of new people who listen to this, people who are interested in painting. Those of us who have gone through the process, we've made a lot of mistakes. Is there such a thing as a shortcut to learning? Is there a proper way to learn?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, part of it has to do with the unlearning of your presupposed ideas of painting and what you're supposed to do. And I think the other is watching someone paint, like all the demos that we have here. That helps a great deal. I wish we had this, growing up when I was a kid. You have the young fellows, young people coming now, and I think that's like, I'm envious.
Yeah. I think we have two people here that are 16 or 17 years old,
right?
Which is pretty encouraging. It means there's a future.
Yeah, I'd like to see a lot more of that.
That's absolutely right.
Also, I'd like to, maybe go back on the right and the wrong when you're starting out. There isn't the right and the wrong there, but you do have to sort of try to make up your goals in it and your aspirations for what you can do, and you try to not imitate other people so much or other paintings, or try to get a thing to look like we all see it. I think everybody has something very special inside of each one of them that needs to come out, wants to come out, and that we all benefit when you express that. You express your individuality in your painting, and you're not comparing yourself to other painters that way. I think that's the biggest trap of all, is that comparing yourself and how how well your stuff is selling and how this and that. It's a trap.
Yeah. So let's talk about that trap. So your gallery, you're in galleries, I assume.
I'm in a few galleries.
Yes. Okay. So your gallery says, that painting with a little red barn really sold really well. Why don't you paint me a few more of those? How do you respond to that? Because they know it's going to sell. They know people will want it, but do you feel like a little dirty doing it a second or a third time? What's your thought on that whole process?
Oh, I got used to feeling dirty. No, that's a tough one, because I think there's some real pragmatic
You gotta eat
involved here.
Yeah.
But in the long run, to quote, was it Moyers? Bill Moyers is he was actually quoting Joseph Campbell. Is just you have to sort of follow your bliss, and that means that your buyers may like the red barn that you did back 5 years ago, but right now your path is a little bit different, right. And I really believe that more people really want to see your red barn 2.0, and see what that is.
So how important is reinvention? Because you can get to a place where you are successful and painting the same things pretty much all the time. Do you have any process you go through to kind of reinvent yourself from time to time?
Oh, absolutely.
Or push yourself?
Absolutely. I believe being a museum rat is a good way to just get out and look at something new. We're living in an amazing time with the internet, with Instagram, and I'm getting images from artists all over the world now that I would never have access to. And all that influences can really throw you around. Like, I want to paint like that, and I want to paint like that. But I think all that stuff comes in, you soak it in, and you see what little things that you might have been stuck on that you like. It's your sort of signature move, but maybe it's time to drop that. And you can see what some other things people are doing that are more exciting than some of your own stylistic moves.
So one of the things we're going through right now is we have this reinvention of photography movement, essentially. The selfie, we have the cell phone that has the photograph on it, and then people, of course, are putting all these photos out on social media, et cetera. And I heard from a young man, sent me an email, and he had done something that I had recommended. He had been interacting with artists online and looking at their images and so on, and he sent me a note asking me about learning to paint or something. I said, go to a museum and look at the images in real life. And he sent me a note back and said, I had no idea. He said, I couldn't tell what these paintings really looked like when I looked at them on my phone. And so I think this idea of, everything is taking place on our phones these days, that's our reality, but getting people out to the museums to view things, it's really is going to stimulate a whole different perspective on the paintings, because we're all looking at everything on social media, but you look at a Jeremy Lipking painting on social media, and then you see it in person, it's just so totally different.
Yeah.
Or yours, quite frankly.
Oh, thank you, Eric. I just was thinking of an event in Richmond, the Richmond PleinAir thing. I watched Ken DeWard standing in front of a John Singer Sargent painting for what seemed like an hour. And he was just, his nose just getting closer and closer and closer, and somebody watching the cameras had to come down from security and pull him back, because nobody stares at a painting that long.
Unless they're planning on stealing it.
Yeah, right. But it was kind of that, something got a hold of Ken, and like, what is John Singer Sargent doing here? And he was just obsessed with it. And so that's a good example.
Well, we have a rare opportunity because we're doing this at the PleinAir convention. Do we have any questions out there from the audience? Would anybody like to step up to the microphone and ask your question? Come right here, and I'll bring the mic right over to here. So if you'll just state your name, just talk right into there.
Hi, my name's Elaine F., and I have a question for Stuart. What is your signature move?
My signature move? I got a couple of them, I think, but I think that's a good question.
Why don't you explain first what a signature move is?
Yeah, maybe that would be the best thing to do. Is I think there's a way that certain painters paint a certain thing, or a certain palette that they use a lot. I think my signature move would have to be, I paint watercolor in a sort of upright way. And it's a little more than 30 degrees. And by doing that, the pigments start to puddle if you make a mark. The pigments kind of puddle at the bottom, and as they dry, they form a little ball of pigment, and it gives it a little more weight. And I noticed Maurice Prendergast, one of the Ashcan painters, did that a lot. But he did it all over the painting. I think that's too much. I like to vary the marks, but I think I rely on that little move, and I just enjoy watching how the paint dries that way. But I'll give it up in a heartbeat if I see something else online. It's better, because I think it's important to always be. It's important to have a brand that people can say, "Oh, I recognize that work. I recognize that person." I think that gives people a certain sense of and I'm paying attention. But I think you could have the freedom. You should have the freedom. It's your painting after all, to move on from that. Maybe you take on a more of a non-objective approach to things. Obscure things. Being an architectural illustrator, it's been my job to describe accurately real space and time, cars and people, and for me to lose those edges and to leave it up to an ambiguous, it could be this, it could be that, is a real challenge for me. But I love it when I see it in other people's work.
Are there any painters that you're just dying to understand how they did what they did? If you were able to meet them at some point, you could ask questions, historic painters, who would you want to ask a question of, and what would the question be?
So many, and I'm going to draw a blank, but I think, and I'll probably remember the name as soon as this interview is over.
Of course.
but he was one of the Glasgow boys, Melvin, Arthur Melvin, and Arthur Melvin was a painter from Scotland. He went to North Africa. He died a young man, but he had this wonderful, rich, deep, ultramarine quality to his paints that he would bounce off of all these vivid yellow golds. And then he did some mysterious things with these sort of bullfight scenes that he did of just amazing draftsmanship. And there's just something about him that I think, being a Scotsman, I think I enjoy having a little bit of whiskey with that guy.
Yeah. All right. And the question?
It would just be sort of, the how-tos, and then the sort of, I think the big question for me would be, how do you take this, scene that's in front of you, and how do you transform it into such an extraordinary, opus that have universal meanings to it, and what's going on internally, what's your intuition part of it, and and what's the vision you start with?
Wouldn't it have been wonderful if we had video of those guys? That's why I'm doing all these videos, because one day our generation of people are going to be gone, and hopefully people will be able to see you paint 200 years from now and see what you've done. And wouldn't that be cool?
Well, that's an excellent segue. I hope you'll all purchase my video, which doesn't.
And where can they find that?
I have no video.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll have a talk about that. Yeah. Well, so in terms of where can people see your work, what's a good place to go?
You can join me in France this fall. I'm giving some wonderful workshops there. I have some flyers here. You can go to my website, stuartwhitestudios.com. That's STEWART. And I've got a lot of gallery work there. And if you're ever in Annapolis or Easton, Maryland, you can go to South Street Gallery there and the McBride Gallery.
Terrific. Do we have any other audience questions? Anybody? Before we wrap up? Everybody's silent. Okay, well, this is kind of fun doing this in front of a live audience. Normally, I'm sequestered in a very small room. And what have we not covered that perhaps you'd like to talk about?
Well, those are really good questions. I really enjoyed
That's how I
this
make my
process.
living.
And no, those are very provocative questions for me. I can't think of anything. I do think there's a great benefit to attending one of these conferences because of the different resources and of all the different painters and their different medium. I think there's probably some unrepresented engravers out there that don't come and do this, and there's not much drawing. But I did notice today one of the pastel instructors was showing our black and white drawings, and I loved seeing those. I think that the conference is constantly in a state of change, and I'm seeing it in the last 6 years that I've been attending, that things get tweaked, and I'm feeling very optimistic about where this is going.
So from the perhaps because people listening might not have ever attended this, the one thing that keeps happening to me is people walk up to me and they say, I had no idea. I had no idea the scale. I had no idea the enthusiasm and the level of quality. And I can't, there's no way to describe this. But if you were going to describe it to somebody, what would you say? What is this experience like?
Well, it has all the trappings of a lot of other professional conferences. There are the gatherings, the different things going on, the things you might be interested in. But I believe it has the uniqueness of putting to work things you've just been absorbing all day, and we go out and paint well into the evening, and I hope that people are taking advantage of trying to meet up with some of the painters that they admire and they want to learn from, and they're here. I haven't met a single one of them that is bothered by anybody talking to them or coming up to them, and so they really look forward to that.
You're wearing a blue faculty hat. What's that all about?
Yeah, if you see these blue faculty hats, it actually went really well with my shirt. So I decided to wear this one. These are the people that are out there. Either they've been giving instruction on stage or they were here the previous years, and they're just here to give you your 2 cents worth, their 2 cents worth, on anything that you might be stuck on, how to get started, any real pragmatic questions about the material, equipment. I think everyone that I've met here has got some 20 plus years of experience painting outdoors.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're careful about how we pick them. Well, Stuart White, thank you so much for being on the PleinAir podcast today. It's a pleasure to have you, and you have the distinction of being the first one ever interviewed live in front of a live audience. Yeah. So how about a hand for Stuart? All right. Well,
you made it easy.
Again, thank you again for the PleinAir podcast. I'm sure I'm supposed to read something here, so I better look it up and see if I can find it. But no, I can't. Anyway, I'll do a proper outro, but thank you again for being on the podcast. I know the podcast was brought to you by AmericanWatercolor.net and also by somebody else who I can't remember. So Thank you again for being here, and au revoir.
Au revoir.